I never quite understood the way Michael looked at me sometimes. It wasn't the usual way he admired me, like when he would comment on my appearance or make a playful joke to lighten the mood. No, this was different. There was something almost observant, but not in the way you'd expect. It was as though he was cataloging every little thing I did. He never said much about it at first, just watched from his usual spot, leaning against the doorframe of our bedroom or sitting on the edge of the couch. His gaze fixed on me as I moved about the room. It started small, almost innocuous. I remember the first time it really struck me, though I didn't give it much thought at the time. I was in the kitchen, just finishing up dinner. I had been slicing vegetables for a salad when I noticed him standing there in the doorway, quietly watching me. It wasn't the casual, "Hey honey, what's for dinner?" type of attention. No, it was as if he was studying the way my hands moved with the knife, the way I adjusted the flame on the stove, the way I added ingredients to the pot. It made me feel peculiar, almost as though I was performing some sort of ritual. "Do you need something?" I had asked, my voice light, almost teasing. He blinked, then smiled faintly. "No, just... you look so focused. I like watching you like this." Caught me off guard. The way he said it felt almost intimate, though he wasn't close to me physically. It was as if I was on display, but not in a way I could quite place. A part of me wondered if he was just in one of those moods, maybe a little worn out from work or just needing some quiet company. But that was the beginning, and in hindsight I should have paid more attention to the way he said it. The pattern continued, though. Whenever I was engaged in something, no matter how trivial, Michael would appear, hovering in the background. He'd sit in the living room while I did my paperwork or read, eyes subtly trained on my movements. It was always so subtle, so easy to dismiss. He didn't follow me around or interrupt my activities. But there was that same presence, that quiet observation that made me feel as though I was the subject of a private study. At first, I chalked it up to him just needing to be near me. He'd always been a bit of a watcher. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. One evening, we were in the living room together, the soft hum of the television filling the air. I was working on a crossword puzzle, the kind I do to wind down after a long day. Michael was sitting on the couch across from me. His legs stretched out lazily, the same soft gaze on me that had started to feel familiar but increasingly unsettling. He wasn't watching the TV. He wasn't really even looking at me in the way you look at someone you're having a conversation with. Instead, his eyes followed my pen as I filled in the blanks. His expression unreadable. I caught him watching me again, that same quiet attention. There was something about it that made me squirm, though I tried to ignore it. He was, after all, my husband. I should be used to it, shouldn't I? But then he spoke, his voice breaking the silence like a soft ripple on still water. "You're so precise when you do that. It's calming to watch." I blinked, not sure what he meant. Was he complimenting me? Or was there something more behind his words? Thanks," I replied, though I felt a strange discomfort in my chest. There was no malice in his tone, no intention to upset me, but the words lingered in the air, leaving a subtle unease. From that night on, the feeling only deepened. It wasn't just the way he watched me anymore. It was the way he seemed to take pleasure in it. The way he seemed fascinated, as if there was something so ordinary about me that he found endlessly interesting. It made my heart ache with a quiet confusion. Why wasn't he ever really with me in the way I expected? He was always just apart, observing. He rarely asked about my day anymore or how I was feeling. Instead, he was focused on these strange moments, these little activities that I barely even noticed myself. And so, it continued. He watched me as I cleaned the house, as I cooked dinner, as I spent time with friends. Always from the sidelines, like I was a character in a story he was reading and couldn't quite put down. But even as I started to feel the weight of his constant attention, I couldn't bring myself to ask him about it. Maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, it's not uncommon for couples to have their own little rituals, right? Maybe this was just his way of connecting with me, his way of showing affection. But still, a small voice in my mind kept asking, was it just that? Or was there something more? I tried to ignore the feeling for a while. It wasn't as if anything was explicitly wrong. Michael was still Michael after all, the man I'd married, the one who could make me laugh on a bad day or hold me close when I was feeling down. The way he watched me, though, was starting to become an unspoken presence in the house. A quiet tension that lingered in the corners of every room, even if I tried to shake it off. One afternoon I was sitting at the dining table, sipping my tea and scrolling through my phone. I had just gotten home from a meeting with my book club, and I felt a slight warmth from the conversation we'd had earlier. It was good to have something outside of the house, outside of the routine, to look forward to. I wasn't always a social person, but those few hours away from home always left me feeling refreshed, if only for a little while. As I glanced up, I noticed Michael standing in the doorway, as usual. His arms were folded across his chest, his expression calm, though his eyes were focused on me in a way that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I set my phone down and smiled weakly. "Hey, Michael. How was your day?" He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there for a moment, eyes locked on me, as if he were studying me. Finally, he leaned against the doorframe and replied, "It was fine." And then came the silence. A silence that felt heavy, like the air was thickening around us. I had gotten used to this by now. He didn't always have a lot to say, but this felt different. The way he watched me didn't seem so much like an idle curiosity anymore. Felt more deliberate, more intent. Like he was searching for something in me. I wanted to ask him if something was wrong. I wanted to ask why he was so quiet lately, why he seemed to be retreating into himself more and more. But there was always something in the way, some invisible wall between us, keeping me from reaching him. Instead, I just nodded, taking another sip of my tea. The silence stretched between us, making my chest feel tight. It wasn't long after that day when I started to notice the other little things. Small, almost insignificant changes, but changes nonetheless. The way he'd ask about my plans for the evening, always wanting to know exactly what I was going to do and who I was going to see. Not in a controlling way, but in a way that felt almost possessive. He'd ask me about every detail. "What time are you leaving? Who's picking you up? Will you be back by midnight?" First, I thought maybe it was just him being thoughtful. But then I started to wonder. Why the over-attention? Why the sudden need to know everything down to the smallest detail? It wasn't that I was hiding anything from him. I never had. But there was a coldness in his questions that made me feel like I was being examined, not as a wife, but as an object under scrutiny. One evening we sat down for dinner, just the two of us. The table was set, the food was warm, and yet there was a chill in the air. Michael was unusually quiet. He usually liked to talk about his day, share little anecdotes about his work or ask me about mine. But tonight he just stared at his plate, pushing the food around without really eating much. I couldn't take it anymore. "Michael," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is something going on? You've been distant lately." He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as if surprised by my question. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something I couldn't quite place. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar, unreadable expression. "No," he said simply, his voice almost too casual. "I'm fine." I wasn't convinced. The way he said it, the way his lips curled into that faint, almost evasive smile, told me there was more. But I didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, I tried to carry on with dinner, but the weight of the conversation, of the unanswered question, hung between us, thick and suffocating. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I could feel the distance. Not physical distance, but something deeper. An emotional gulf that seemed to have widened without either of us acknowledging it. I reached out for him instinctively, but he didn't move. He was facing the other way. His body turned away from mine, as it had been for weeks now. I wanted to reach out and say something, ask him to talk to me, to tell me what was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Maybe I was afraid of the answers. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew that whatever was going on between us, whatever had changed, wasn't something I could fix with words alone. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard his voice. "You're beautiful when you're lost in thought," he said softly. His voice almost a whisper. I turned my head to face him. He was looking at me again, his eyes soft, but there was that same strange intensity behind them. It wasn't the casual compliment I was used to hearing. It felt more like an observation, something he was quietly noting, as if it was the most fascinating thing in the world to him. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Thanks," I murmured, my heart heavy with uncertainty. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The husband I knew, the man who once shared everything with me, was slipping away. And all I could do was watch him from the sidelines, the same way he watched me. The days passed slowly, the tension between Michael and me growing with each quiet glance, every unnoticed gesture. I could feel the growing distance between us like a heavy fog, but I couldn't shake it. It wasn't just the way he watched me anymore. It was the way he was present, yet absent. We were physically in the same house, sharing the same space, but something was missing. Something I couldn't reach. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. I started keeping track of the small things, the moments that felt too strange to dismiss anymore. Like the way Michael would sometimes leave the room just as I walked into it, or how he would go silent whenever I asked about his day. There was a time when he would share every little detail, even the trivial things that I didn't really care about, just to make conversation. But now his answers were short, and his smiles were fleeting. It wasn't that he was ignoring me, Percy. It was just that he didn't see me anymore. Not in the way I needed him to. I tried to keep things normal, going through the motions of our usual routines. I'd cook dinner, clean the house, talk to him about my day. But no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to engage him, it always felt like he was somewhere else. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if it was something more than that, but it seemed like his attention was always just a little too focused on me. It wasn't as though he was interested in what I was saying. No, it was like he was studying me, like I was a puzzle that he was trying to figure out piece by piece. One evening, I finally couldn't stand it anymore. Had to know. Had to ask. It was a Tuesday just like any other. I had come back from a long day at work, tired but trying to shake off the heaviness that had been creeping in. Michael was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, but his attention was elsewhere. It always seemed to be elsewhere, even when he was right there beside me. I couldn't remember the last time we had a conversation that didn't feel strained, like the space between us was too wide to cross. I set my things down on the coffee table and sat down beside him, turning to face him fully. He glanced at me, but only for a moment, before his gaze drifted back to the book in his hands. "Michael," I started, my voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." He didn't look up from his book, but I could tell he'd heard me. The faint tightening of his jaw gave it away. His body language had become so predictable, like a silent warning. I didn't want to push him into a corner, but I knew I had to confront this. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel the wall between us. "Is something wrong?" "Yes. You've been acting so distant lately. I don't know what's going on anymore." His eyes flicked up to meet mine, but there was no warmth there, just that same unreadable expression I had seen so many times in the past few weeks. "No," he replied slowly, his voice low. "Nothing's wrong." I tried not to let my frustration show. It was always the same response, always that calm, distant tone. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see how much this was hurting me. But instead I pressed on, my voice more insistent. "I don't believe that, Michael," I said quietly. "You're different. You're not the same. You don't talk to me like you used to. You barely even look at me anymore." He finally closed the book and set it down on the coffee table with a soft thud. There was a long silence between us, thick and heavy, before he spoke again. "I'm not different, Claire," he said, his voice softer now. I'm just thinking." I frowned, trying to understand. "Thinking about what?" He looked at me, his eyes darkening slightly. About you. About us. I felt a chill run through me at the way he said it. There was something in his voice, something in the way his words hung in the air, that made my stomach tighten. I don't understand, I whispered, more to myself than to him. His gaze softened a little then, but there was no real warmth behind it. You don't have to understand, Claire. You just have to trust me. Trust. That was a word I hadn't heard him use in a long time, and it made me recoil. What did he mean by it? Trust him to do what? To keep watching me like I was some kind of experiment? Trust him to stay the same, or trust him to change into something? Something I didn't know. I swallowed hard, not sure if I was ready for the answer I was afraid would come. Do you love me? I asked almost as a reflex. It wasn't a question I should have had to ask, but it escaped my lips before I could stop it. His expression faltered just for a moment, and I caught the briefest flicker of something that looked like uncertainty, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned forward, his voice lowering again. Of course I love you, Claire. You know that. But his words felt hollow. They lacked the sincerity I had once relied on from him. It was as though he was reciting a line he'd learned by heart, not something he truly felt anymore. I wanted to say something, to ask him how he could look at me like that and still say he loved me, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, the unease spreading through me like cold water. He didn't need to explain. I already knew, deep down, that the man who stood before me wasn't the same man I had married. Before I could gather my thoughts, he stood up from the couch, walking toward the hallway with that same measured pace. I didn't stop him. Couldn't. The conversation had gone as far as it could, and in some ways I didn't know if I wanted to know more. But as he disappeared down the hallway, I was left with a horrible, suffocating sense that this was only the beginning. That whatever was happening between us, whatever was unraveling, was something neither of us could stop. I just didn't know if I could stand to watch it fall apart any longer. It was a week after our conversation that I began to feel something that was beyond just discomfort. It was a quiet, crawling fear, a gnawing feeling in my chest that something was horribly wrong, and yet I still couldn't name it. Michael and I existed in the same house, sharing space without really sharing anything anymore. I would come home from work, set my things down, and try to engage with him, but it was like we were on different planets, orbiting each other but never truly touching. Each night felt the same. Dinner together in silence, the distant hum of the television filling the gaps where conversation used to be. The longer it went on, the more I noticed how detached Michael had become. He wasn't angry, he wasn't hostile, he was just absent. He might smile at me from across the room, but it was always a shadow of the smile I remembered. He never asked about my day anymore, never offered little touches of affection like he once had. It was as if he had decided to step back entirely, to observe from a distance. And as the days passed, I found myself observing him too. It was a Sunday evening when it happened. I had spent most of the afternoon cleaning the house, just to keep myself busy. I wanted to feel some sense of normalcy, some way to hold on to the routine that had anchored us for years. But nothing felt normal. Michael was sitting in the living room again, his attention fixed on something. Maybe his phone, maybe nothing at all, but whatever it wasn't me. I stopped folding laundry and stared at him from the hallway, unsure of what to do. My heart felt heavy. I didn't want to push him, but I couldn't stand it any longer. He was slipping through my fingers like sand. I walked into the living room, standing in the doorway as I watched him. He didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed, and for a brief moment, I felt like an intruder in my own home. Michael, I said softly, my voice shaky but resolute. I need to ask you something. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, but it wasn't the familiar warmth I was used to. It was something else. Distant as ever, and almost disinterested. What is it? He asked, his tone polite but detached. The air between us felt so thick that I could barely breathe. I had to force the words out, but they were there, raw and urgent. Are you seeing someone else? The question hung in the air like a grenade, threatening to explode. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, each thud deafening in my ears. I'd asked it. The question that had been circling in my mind for weeks. But once it was out, I immediately regretted it. I wished I could pull the words back, stuff them in my mouth before they left, because I was terrified of what I might hear. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at me, and in his eyes I saw a flicker of something. Guilt. Shame. Maybe it was just a reflection of my own fear. Finally he sighed. It wasn't a sigh of relief, like someone admitting the truth. It wasn't even a sigh of regret. It was something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. "No," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not seeing anyone else, Claire. You're the only one." But his eyes told a different story. Something in my chest twisted, and I could feel the cold burn of doubt creeping into my veins. I didn't trust his words anymore, not after everything. The way he said it, the emptiness in his voice, told me that there was more going on, something I didn't know about. His answer didn't feel like a lie, but it also didn't feel like the truth I needed. It felt like a half-truth, carefully constructed to give me enough comfort to stay in the dark. "I'm not sure what to believe anymore, Michael," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm not sure I even recognize you anymore." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and the moment they were spoken, I felt the weight of their truth. He wasn't the man I had married. Not anymore. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes remaining fixed on me, but now there was something else, something softer. Regret, perhaps, or maybe it was just guilt. Whatever it was, it didn't give me the closure I was searching for. Instead, it left me with more questions, more pain, more uncertainty. "I'm sorry, Claire," he finally said, and for the first time in weeks, his voice seemed to crack just slightly. I've been thinking about things. Thinking about things." The words felt hollow, just like the rest of his explanations. Thinking about what? About me. About us. About the life we'd built. "You don't talk to me anymore, Michael," I said, my voice trembling now. "You just watch me. Watch me like I'm some kind of puzzle you're trying to figure out. What happened to us? What happened to you?" He stood up slowly, like he was moving through molasses, and I saw the familiar weariness in his movements. But he didn't come closer to me. He didn't reach out, as he might have once done when things were hard between us. Instead, he simply sighed again, rubbing his temples as though trying to push away the thoughts in his head. "I don't know, Claire," he said softly, and there was a defeat in his voice that I hadn't heard before. "I just don't know. I wish I could explain it, but I can't." I wanted to scream at him then, to demand that he tell me everything, to tell me what was really going on behind those eyes. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, not anymore. The silence between us was too loud, too deafening. And I couldn't bring myself to break it. "I don't know what's happening anymore," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." He didn't respond. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that fills the room with an oppressive weight, suffocating everything in its path. I stood there, rooted to the spot, and watched him, waiting for something to change. For him to say something that would make it all better. But nothing came. He just turned away, walking back to the hallway without a word. I wanted to follow him, to beg him to talk to me, to fix whatever was broken between us. But I didn't. Couldn't. And as I stood there, the realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me with unrelenting force. I had already lost him. The man I loved, the man I thought I knew, was gone. And all I had left were the shadows of the person he used to be. The days after that night felt like a slow, dragging descent into something I couldn't control. Michael and I existed in the same space, but it was as if we were ghosts to one another. The house was quiet, the hum of silence louder than any words we might have said. Our routine, if you could even call it that anymore, was a mechanical series of actions. Breakfast, work, dinner, sleep, each part as hollow as the last. I tried to find comfort in the small things. A moment of quiet in the evening. A smile from a stranger in passing. But it was always fleeting. Nothing could fill the emptiness that had settled inside me. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my things and stepping into the unknown, where maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again. But I didn't have the strength. The idea of being alone was terrifying, and I wasn't sure if it was the alone part that scared me, or the idea of leaving behind the life I had built. The life that was now in ruins. One evening, I came home to find Michael sitting in the living room again, just as he had every other day. But this time the air felt different, thick with anticipation or maybe dread. As I stepped inside, he didn't look up immediately. I set my purse down on the table and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess, but I knew what I had to do. I had to ask him one final time. "Michael," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "We need to talk. For real this time." He put down the book he was holding and finally looked at me. There was nothing in his eyes, nothing at all, except the same distance that had haunted us for weeks. "About what?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled. Almost as if he already knew what was coming. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. But I couldn't back down now. I was done pretending I didn't know what was going on, that I didn't feel the disintegration of our marriage happening before my eyes. "You're not the same, Michael," I said softly. "I don't know who you are anymore. You're distant and you're gone somehow. I'm not asking for explanations anymore. I need to know what's going on, really going on. Because I can't live like this." He stood up slowly, as if the weight of my words had finally settled on him. But instead of anger or frustration, there was something else in his eyes now, something that looked like resignation. It was the kind of look you give someone when you know it's over, but you don't have the strength to admit it yet. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I've been trying to figure things out. I've been trying to fix what's broken. But I don't know how. I don't know how to fix this." My chest tightened, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I had waited for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it felt like a cruel trick. The words didn't come out the way I expected them to. I thought I'd feel anger or relief or maybe even vindication, but all I felt was sorrow. Deep, aching sorrow. "Michael, I can't do this anymore," I whispered. "I can't keep pretending we're okay when we're not. I can't keep waiting for you to come back to me when I'm not sure you ever will." He took a step toward me, but I took a step back, putting the space between us that had grown over time. The silence between us stretched out, thick and painful, before he finally spoke again. "I never meant to hurt you, Claire," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never meant for any of this to happen. But I don't know how to make it right anymore." I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know if you can. I don't know if we can make it right." For a long moment we stood there, facing each other in the stillness of the room, both of us holding on to something we couldn't explain. There was so much unsaid, so much left to figure out, but in that moment I understood something. I understood that no amount of words could fix what was broken between us. No amount of trying could put the pieces back together once they had shattered. "You're not the man I married," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm not sure I can stay with someone I don't even know anymore." Michael didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mixture of pain and acceptance. And in that silence, I made my decision. I turned away from him and walked out of the living room, my heart heavy, my mind clouded with doubt. But I knew deep down that I couldn't stay. I couldn't continue living in a marriage that had become a shell of what it once was. I needed to be free, even if I didn't know what that freedom looked like. The next few days were a blur. I packed my things, moved into a small apartment, and let go of everything that had once defined me. The house, the life I had built, the man I thought I knew, they were all behind me now. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would find happiness again, or if I would ever feel whole. But I knew I couldn't stay in the ruins of a relationship that was beyond repair. In the end, I didn't stay with Michael. Not because I didn't love him anymore, but because I had to love myself more than I loved the idea of saving something that was already gone. And as I stepped into my new life, I realized something important. I didn't need him to make me whole. I was whole, even if I didn't yet understand how. But I would.